Before Lincoln's presidency, he was a normal boy growing up in America. However, he didn't have the luxury of only growing up in one town. Instead, he bounced around from town to town and finally ended up in Illinois. Lincoln's childhood was not the best, or even close to it for that matter. Instead, he had to deal with the heartache of his mother, Nancy, dying when he was only 9, and his somewhat brutal father. Lincoln's father wasn't easy on him, and he wasn't the most pro-intellect type of guy, such as Lincoln was. If there was one thing that Lincoln's father had taught him, it was that he for sure did not want to be a farmer. So instead of doing this, Lincoln started to clear his father's land with an axe. This is where the whole Lincoln with his axe ideas came from. However, he didn't do this long, and once he was of age, he went on to study law and become a lawyer. Although, like much of what Lincoln's outcomes were, he wasn't a definite success in law, but it was these losses, these setbacks, that fetched Lincoln to be one of the best presidents of all time. Just before Lincoln became a lawyer, he enlisted to fight in the Black Hawk War, which was a war that was meant to push the Indians further west. This war was a small-scale war, but it was the first taste of military that Lincoln received. Lincoln was successful in this, and he was promoted to an officer position before his time of duty ran out. Lincoln would even go on to say how this victory gave more satisfaction than any election he ever won, which is crazy to think because he would become the President of the United States. When talking about Lincoln and why he dealt with being the commander-in-chief the way he did, it's necessary to mention not only his visible struggles, but also his mental struggles. He wasn't the most stable guy, to say the least. He was known for usually being in a mood of melancholy, and he even said one of the most depressing statements that a president had ever said, saying, quote, "I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would not be one cheerful face on earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me." When Lincoln said this, it was in a letter to his best friend and roommate, Joshua Speed. This whole sense of feeling that Lincoln has will stick with him throughout the rest of his life and into his presidency. It isn't crazy to think that this sense of depression that led Lincoln had helped him get his perspective of what the slaves were going through, which led him to wanting to free them. Once he did get involved in politics, it wasn't smooth sailing. He didn't automatically win all of his elections. For example, Lincoln tried to be the Republican vice president nominee, but failed. Also, he ran for senator and lost to Stephen Douglas. It took perseverance and hope for him to keep moving forward. When Lincoln did win the presidency, he won with only a 40% majority vote. Since the Democratic Party was split up into the North and South, it opened up the Republican Party to win since the Democratic Party was split into two. These humble beginnings would stick to Lincoln for the rest of his presidency, and it would be these tough times that would help him persevere and make some of the most difficult decisions of America's history. Learning to be commander-in-chief could have been one of the most difficult obstacles for Lincoln. Unlike his counterparts, he wasn't schooled at West Point or anything like that. The only experience that the president had was that small-scale Black Hawk War that I mentioned earlier. Lincoln was successful in this war, but he was nowhere near the rank of commander-in-chief. Having this ultimate military rank while being the president of the United States is one of the hardest jobs a man can have. Herman Hathaway says how, quote, "The American people admire a chieftain who can command their allegiance." Lincoln did this, and it was exactly what the American people needed at the time. They needed a strong leader, someone who would lead them out of an inevitable civil war. Lincoln was able to master this 19th century conventional warfare in an extremely short time. His knowledge of education itself is what enabled him to do this. Lincoln was mostly self-taught when he was growing up. He often read and he looked for education in any way he could find it. For this reason, he was able to understand some of the smartest officers that came from West Point. High intellect generals like George McClellan aided Lincoln into having this understanding. Ironically, in time, Lincoln would become a much better general than McClellan and many other generals that took place in the Confederate cause in the Civil War. Lincoln had a difficult task for what he had to do with being the president and the commander-in-chief. However, he was able to do both to the best ability. The Middle States were of great importance during this war. Lincoln was very strategic and smart with these states. He knew the importance of them since they were literally the middle of the battle lines. Also, with keeping these middle states, it took away a lot of resources from the South who were already limited in these resources. McPherson talks about how the Southern generals assumed that they would gain support from the middle states when they invaded, but in reality, it was the opposite. Since Lincoln was wise and allowed the middle states to have slavery throughout this war, he was able to have this advantage. Instead of gaining momentum, it was actually the North that gained momentum when the South invaded the war. By the South invading, it made the war real for the Northerners. This concept allowed the North to become much more motivated in these battles. Lincoln himself actually never freed the slaves in the Middle States. It was those states that would eventually free the slaves almost 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Another somewhat political issue that had great military complications were the complexities in England at this time. Lincoln had to be very careful with the relations with England, since if the South received aid from England, their chances would have greatly increased to win the war. The thing that helped the North in this position was that the South was obviously pro-slavery, and England was not. They had their own abolition movement before America, and they were not about to help keep slavery around in America. They ended slavery in 1833, 30 years before it was outlawed in the United States. So Lincoln had to be sure he was on good terms with England, and he did some interesting things to do that. To start off, he responded to the working men of England who addressed him in a newspaper article. This newspaper article said how, since they were aware of the whole slave aspect of war, they said, quote, "My prayer is that it will fail of its diabolical purpose." With this attitude, it was sure that England was pro-abolition, and that they wouldn't aid the South in prolonging slavery. Interestingly enough, Lincoln actually responds to this Manchester newspaper. In his response, he talks about how foreign intervention could greatly change the outcome of the war. This is true, and Lincoln did everything right in order to stop foreign invention. Lincoln faced political issues in this war with people being his allies, or at least not against them, like the Middle States and England. However, he was also forced to do this with his generals. His generals were political, and not in a good way. Grudges were held, disputes were often, and it made it hard to get the job done. Despite all of Lincoln's great ideas in the Civil War, his method of appointing generals may have been one of his worst. One example of a political general that Lincoln appointed was Nathaniel P. Banks. Banks was a politician, and there was no arguing that it was fact. He was a former Speaker of the House of Representatives and was the governor of Massachusetts. What he did to become a major general was questionable, to say the least, but Lincoln appointed him, and when he did, he eventually fell victim to Stonewall Jackson in the Shenandoah Valley. Another horrific political general that Lincoln appointed was Benjamin Butler. Butler was an incompetent general who, quote, lacked the ability to direct an army in the field, end quote. These two generals are just examples of two people who Lincoln appointed that didn't pan out to be successful in the war. Political generals were also negative, since there are always two sides in politics, and some generals were on the other side. The best example of a general against Lincoln was McClellan. McClellan was yet another incompetent general who was the opposite of Lincoln in almost every way. His schooling was the opposite. He graduated at West Point and second in his class. His military ideals were different. He was one of the most conservative, passive generals of this time period. And, of course, his political ideas were opposite of Lincoln, with him being a Democrat. A great example of McClellan's great passiveness was one that made Lincoln increasingly angry, was when he had the plans to the Confederate strategy. He knew where the Confederates were and he knew how vulnerable they were. He even telegraphed Lincoln saying how susceptible the Southern troops were. However, he waited and waited until 4 days had passed, and by that time Lee's army wasn't separated and not nearly as vulnerable. McClellan had the chance to end the war, to force the Confederates back into the Union, and to end the great deathly battles of the Civil War, but he didn't attack, and the bloodbaths continued. Interestingly enough, if McClellan would have successfully taken down the Confederates in this battle and forced them to rejoin the Union, slaves might have then lasted longer in America, since it was before the Emancipation Proclamation was addressed by Lincoln. The Emancipation Proclamation was what literally proclaimed emancipation for the slaves of the seceded states. If Lincoln and the Confederates would have preserved the Union sooner, Lincoln might have taken longer to address this. The Emancipation Proclamation had much more thought into it than one would have thought. In this day and age, it's easy to think that it was just given, that it was almost implied, but this is far from the case. In reality, Lincoln waited to address this for the perfect time. Lincoln was in a resentful mood after having to hear about how McClellan's didn't have enough troops and didn't have the resources to beat the South, who had less troops and less supplies than them. And because of this, Lincoln wanted to address this Emancipation Proclamation. However, the Union was not in a good state at this time, and William Seward, the Secretary of State at the time, advised Lincoln to postpone his proclamation until the Union had military success, or else the world would view this as, quote, the last measure of an exhausted government. This was a smart move by Seward and Lincoln, and ensured that the proclamation would be respected by the people, not just belittled because the government was weak. The Emancipation Proclamation was eventually spoken on January 1st, 1863, just 3.5 months after the major turning point of the war, the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln and McClellan will always be compared in history because they were both very high in the military rankings of the United States, and they had very differing views. They disagreed on many aspects of war, ideas, and even their personalities clashed. Their arguments became somewhat heated, and as the war came to a close, it was obvious who was right and who was wrong. Lincoln was indubitably right. McClellan would go on to have books written about his failures, while Lincoln about his greatness. Lincoln would go on to be known as one of the best presidents of American history, winning 2 terms and beating McClellan in the second election, while McClellan really only had his diploma at West Point to be proud of. Despite all of Lincoln's successes, he had to pay the price that so many of his soldiers had to pay. Unfortunately, Lincoln was assassinated at a theater on April 14, 1865, just a month before the official end date of the Civil War. After all Lincoln had done, after all the great leadership he provided, he was lost, at a time when the Union needed him most. This was a confusing time for America, and it made the rebuilding process much more difficult without one of the greatest presidents of all time. However, the United States' government system of replacing presidents succeeded. Vice President Andrew Johnson quickly came to power, and Reconstruction was then underway. There was no power siege or corruption, which was huge for a somewhat unstable government. In the end, Lincoln proved to be one of the wisest individuals of American history, and what festered this wisdom wasn't his accomplishments, but his losses. He learned from every loss and kept moving forward. It was this ideology that got him through one of the toughest times in American history. The greatest journalist of the Union, not McClellan, noticed this wisdom. Ulysses S. Grant continually mentioned how great Lincoln was, and how he was so willingly to accept guidance. This was needed to be a great president and commander-in-chief. Lincoln's humbleness was one of the many reasons as to why he was able to be so successful. Currently, Lincoln is known to be one of the greatest presidents of all time, right up there with Washington. His praise and noteworthiness is shown in many different ways. For one, there are books written for how great he is. Secondly, he was on 2 of the most credible monuments in the United States. His face appears on Mount Rushmore, and the Lincoln Memorial is one of the best memorials that someone could ask for. Lastly, scholars devote their lives to studying his ways and how he did what he did. Lincoln deserves all the praise for doing what he had to do. He became the President of the U.S. after coming from a mediocre family that didn't fully support education. Then he rose from a farming family to become a lawyer, then onto politics. He persevered throughout losing elections and kept moving forward. Eventually, he became the president of the most divided country in the world and had the seemingly impossible task of preserving the Union. And he did this and more. Not only did he preserve the Union, but he freed the slaves in states that left the Union in order to have slaves. Lincoln was one of the greatest military minds and political minds to ever be an American president, and he deserves all the credit that is given to him.